Believers in the monotheistic tradition have always held that God is perfectly good, and Christian theologians have thought of God as the fount of all varieties of goodness, whether moral, metaphysical, aesthetic, or any other. Here, our primary interest is in God's moral goodness from a Christian perspective. Obviously, as a being worthy of worship, God possesses moral attributes. A being that is very good, but morally imperfect, might be worthy of admiration or respect, but only a being that is morally perfect could be worthy of worship. Indeed, perfect being theology entails by definition that God is morally perfect, since to be morally imperfect or morally flawed is inconsistent with perfection. Hence, God must be perfectly good. An important question arises in connection with God's perfect goodness, namely, what is the content of God's perfect goodness? In order to answer this question, let us look first to the biblical data concerning divine goodness. So, Section 1, Biblical Data Concerning Divine Goodness. The Bible ascribes to God a wealth of moral properties, including holiness, righteousness, love, grace, mercy, long-suffering, loving kindness, faithfulness, and so on. We might think that the goodness of God is a general moral property designating God's moral perfection and comprising his righteousness, love, grace, mercy, long-suffering, and so forth. But biblically speaking, this would be, in fact, incorrect. Rather, as John Feinberg explains, the Hebrew words for goodness, tov and tuv, have, like the English word, a breadth of meanings. 1, practical, economic, or material blessing. 2, abstract properties such as desirability, pleasantness, and beauty. 3, quality or expense. 4, moral goodness. And 5, eudaimonia, the good life. When the biblical authors speak of God's goodness, what they typically have in mind is not God's moral goodness, but God's beneficence or generosity. Thus, the Psalms are filled with grateful praises for the goodness of the Lord. Feinberg concludes, when we look at the biblical concept of divine goodness, one major idea stands out. It is that God is concerned about the well-being of his creatures and does things to promote it. Of course, God is interested in doing what is morally good and right, but biblical writers capture that idea by referring to his righteousness and holiness. Since our interest is in God's moral goodness, we are therefore better advised to look more closely at the biblical data concerning God's righteousness rather than his goodness. The Hebrew word tzedek, or righteousness, and the Greek expression dikaiosune theou, the righteousness of God, are Janus-faced terms used to denote, among other things, God's moral character. That is to say, God's righteousness in Scripture looks in two directions, as it were, covering both God's love and his justice. Feinberg observes that there is a wealth of biblical material concerning the righteousness of God. Words deriving from the root tzedek occur 523 times in the Old Testament. The nominal forms fall mainly into three groups: legal righteousness, 123 times, ethical righteousness, 114 times, and correctness, 26 times. The New Testament has 92 examples of the noun dikaiosune, 39 of the verb dikaiao, to justify or reckon righteous, 81 of the adjective dikaios, just or righteous, 10 of the noun dikaioma, ordinance or sentence of justification, and 5 of the adverb dikaios, justly or righteously. In recent decades, a debate about the expression dikaiosune theou has arisen as a result of the so-called new perspective on Paul, some proponents of which construe God's righteousness to be his covenant faithfulness. This construal is not itself new, but goes back to German theologians like Hermann Kramer of the late 19th century. Kramer believed that the righteousness of God is not a normative concept, but rather a relational concept involving persons. He claimed, moreover, that God's righteousness has only to do with God's saving activity. Kramer did not deny that God's salvation of the righteous entails his punishment of the wicked, but he insisted that God's righteousness finds expression only in his saving action. Proponents of the new perspective have followed Kramer in thinking God's righteousness to be a relational, not a normative concept, and have identified it with God's being faithful to his covenant people. The claim here seems to be implausible on the face of it, for it amounts to nothing less than the claim that teams of English translators, not to mention non-English translators, have for generations actually mistranslated the expression dikaiosune theou, since the English word righteousness just does not mean faithfulness. Proponents of the new perspective would have us believe that the meaning of New Testament Greek dik words, under the influence of the Septuagint, has been fundamentally changed so as to introduce covenantal ideas not present in extra-biblical Greek. The Hebrew word tzedek, also in effect mistranslated as righteousness, is also said not to express a normative concept like moral goodness, but rather a relational concept like faithful to. The implausibility of the new perspective's reductionism is perhaps best seen by asking what the opposite of righteousness, that is, unrighteousness, is said by Paul to be. It is not unfaithfulness, but wickedness and ungodliness, Romans 1:18, or lawlessness, 2 Corinthians 6:14. Faithlessness is but one of the litany of sins listed by Paul, which results in God's just condemnation, Romans 1:29-31 and 2:2. Righteousness is a broad moral property which entails faithfulness, since to break one's word is wrong, but is not reducible to it. As Mark Seifert puts it, all covenant keeping is righteous behavior, but not all righteous behavior is covenant keeping. It is misleading, therefore, to speak of God's righteousness as his covenant faithfulness, end quote. Seifert points out that righteousness language in the Old Testament has primarily to do with God's role as judge and ruler of creation. As such, it is normative, having to do with God's establishing right moral order in the world. It takes on a positive or salvific sense because the biblical writers expect God to intervene to reinstate right order when it is usurped by evil in the world. It takes on a negative or punitive sense because the biblical writers expect reinstatement of right order to involve the punishment of the wicked. As Seifert so aptly puts it, retribution remains on the backside of divine acts of righteousness. So, while there are 64 instances of God's saving righteousness in the Old Testament, Seifert counts as well 15 cases in which God's righteousness is conceived in retributive or punitive terms. God's righteousness comprises both aspects. Fortunately, proponents of the new perspective have now backed away from the overly simplistic, one-sided conception of God's righteousness. For example, James D.G. Dunn, in response to his critics, acknowledges that the Hebrew concept of righteousness cannot be reduced to covenant faithfulness or salvation. Righteousness language in the Hebrew Scriptures also involves punitive divine justice, according to which righteousness, quote, is understood as measured by a norm, right order, or that which is morally right, with the qualification that the norm is not seen as some abstract ideal, but rather as a norm concretized in relation between God and creatures. So, when we come to Romans, Dunn says that God's righteousness towards the people he has created includes wrath and judgment as well as faithfulness and salvation, is clearly implicit in the sequences Romans 1, 16 to 18, and 3, 3 to 6. The righteousness of God, therefore, seems to be the relevant biblical concept for God's moral perfection and comprises both his love and justice. On the one hand, the Scriptures famously assert God is love, 1 John 4:8, and even ascribe relationships of love to the eternal Trinitarian persons. At the same time, the Scriptures are replete with references to God's hatred of sin, jealousy, wrath, and vengeance, which are manifestations of his justice. Section 2, the content of God's moral character. A number of contemporary philosophical theologians have sought to reduce the content of God's moral character to his agape love. Jordan Vessling has dubbed this thesis the identity thesis. The thesis is that God's love is identical to his moral goodness, such that God possesses no moral attribute that is not essentially and most fundamentally a matter of love. Yeah. This superficially appealing thesis seems to be the lingering vestige of classical liberal theology, which eschewed the justice and wrath of God in favor of his love. Despite the eclipse of classical liberal theology in the early 20th century, it has become almost an axiom among contemporary theologians that God does not need to be reconciled to sinners. The entire obstacle lies on our side. It is said that because the New Testament authors use the verb katalasso to reconcile and its cognates only with respect to human beings, not God, we may infer that God does not need to be reconciled to humanity, but only humanity to a welcoming God. Our hearts need to be changed so that our hostility to God evaporates and we embrace his love. Such an argument from silence, however, overlooks the abundant scriptural testimony to God's justice and wrath, which may demand satisfaction and propitiation. In contrast to classical liberal theology, neoliberal theology, if we may coin a term, affirms God's wrath, but sees it wholly as a manifestation of his love, aimed at the reformation of sinners. Wessling adduces two lines of New Testament evidence in support of the identity thesis. First, Jesus, as well as various New Testament authors, teach that love fulfills the law. Second, Jesus, as well as certain biblical authors, ground this completed human ethic of love in God's nature. These considerations do not, however, bear the theological weight that Wessling would lay upon them. The appeal to Jesus' aphorism about love's fulfilling the law's positive demands overlooks what those who break the law are said to deserve, which is punitive justice. That the law reflects God's loving character most certainly does not imply that God's righteousness does not comprise justice as well as love, or that his justice is reducible to his love. We have seen that, biblically speaking, punitive justice as well as love belongs to God's righteousness. But what sort of justice is this? Theories of punitive justice may be broadly classed as either retributive or consequentialist. Retributive theories of justice hold that punishment is justified because the guilty deserve to be punished. Consequentialist theories of justice hold that punishment is justified because of the extrinsic goods that may be realized thereby, such as deterrence of crime, sequestration of dangerous persons, and reformation of wrongdoers. Retributive theories are often said to be retrospective, imposing punishments for crimes committed, whereas consequentialist theories are prospective, aiming to prevent crimes from being committed. Retributivism may be further distinguished as either positive or negative. While negative retributivism holds that the innocent should not be punished because they do not deserve it, the essence of retributive justice lies in positive retributivism, which holds that the guilty should be punished because they deserve it. What distinguishes retributivism as a theory of justice is the positive thesis that the punishment of the guilty is an intrinsic good because the guilty deserve it. The intrinsic goodness of the punishment of the guilty does not preclude that there are also extrinsic goods that might be achieved by giving people their just desert. But what ultimately justifies punishment is that it is the just desert of the guilty. In the Bible, God is described as a positive retributivist who will by no means clear the guilty. Exodus 34:7. In the biblical view, the wicked deserve punishment. Romans 1:32. Hebrews 10:29, and the Bible ascribes to God retribution, in the Hebrew gemul, as in Isaiah 59:18, or nekama, Jeremiah 50:15, and in the Greek ekdikesis, Romans 11:9, and antipodoma, Romans 12:19, punishment, retribution for sins. So that God's justice must be, in some significant measure, retributive. The God of the Bible is not just a benevolent father figure, but as Hugo Grotius emphasized in his critique of Faustus Socinus, God is the impartial ruler and judge of the creation, responsible for maintaining its moral order. Indeed, it is plausible, I think, that retributive justice belongs essentially to God. The more central and prominent an attribute is in the biblical picture of God, the stronger the case for taking it to be an essential attribute of God, rather than accidental to him. It's hard to think of an attribute more central and prominent in the biblical picture of God than his righteousness, which comprises his justice. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Genesis 18:25. Is there injustice, adikia, on God's part? By no means. Romans 9:14. It would have been inconceivable to the biblical authors that God might act unjustly. Kevin Kinghorn, like Socinus, disputes that retributive justice belongs to God's essence. For God, existing alone, sans creation, would not exhibit retributive justice in intra-Trinitarian relationships. Quote, because the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit could never wrong one another, retributive justice would never be operative, end quote. He concludes, quote, God's attribute of justice is not essential to God's nature in the way that his attribute of love is essential. God's justice is only needed in the world, such as ours, where there are imperfections and shortages. God's essential nature is therefore not just, end quote. But this objection is misconceived. God can have the property of giving every person his due without the existence of created persons. Indeed, negative retributive justice is operative in the intra-Trinitarian relationships. Kinghorn is right that sans creation, God is not wrathful, just as he is not wrathful in possible worlds in which created persons never sin, so that wrath is not an essential property of God. But God, though wrathless, is in such circumstances still essentially righteous and perfectly just. In any case, in relation to created persons, the God of the Bible exhibits retributive justice. Wessling notwithstanding, there is no prima facie incompatibility between God's valuing the flourishing of people and valuing friendship with them, even though he sentences them to their just desert with no expectation of reform. Retributivism is perfectly compatible with God's ongoing love for those he punishes, even the damned in hell, just as it is possible for a judge personally to love and forgive someone brought before his bar, even as he declares him guilty and sentences him to severe punishment. God can personally will the good of sinners and desire their union with him without waiving the demands of retributive justice. In short, God's giving the guilty their just desert does not preclude his loving them. During the first half of the 20th century, under the influence of psychologists and social scientists, retributive theories of justice were frowned upon in favor of consequentialist theories. Fortunately, there has been, over the last half-century or so, a renaissance of theories of retributive justice, accompanied by a fading of consequentialist theories, so that the Christian theologian working within the mainstream position need not be diverted by the need to justify a retributive theory of justice. It is striking that proponents of the identity thesis tend to endorse, explicitly or implicitly, a consequentialist theory of divine justice. For they insist that God's sole purpose in punishing wrongdoers is reformative rather than retributive. So, for example, Kinghorn says that God's administration of justice will ultimately be for the same reason that we need rules of law in the first place, namely, the benevolent goal that people flourish. In response to Arthur Holmes' critique of Christian consequentialism, Kinghorn does not address the shortcomings of consequentialist theories of justice, but simply doubles down in affirming a sort of Christian utilitarianism. He appeals to God to direct our efforts to ensure that acts of beneficence are also equitable, which only pushes the problem upstairs, so to speak. Does God direct his acts in accordance with justice? Kinghorn responds, I find no reason for thinking that justice must be added to God's love in order to give God's actions direction. End quote. Given a consequentialist theory of justice, God's love suffices to motivate his harsh treatment of sinners aimed at their reformation. Kinghorn declares, and I quote, God's expressions of wrath are not vindictive or emotional outbursts aimed at the punishment of unrighteous people as an ultimate goal, end quote. This characterization of retributivism is, of course, a straw man, for the retributivist would agree that God's expressions of wrath are not vindictive or emotional outbursts, but may nonetheless be aimed at the punishment of unrighteous people as the ultimate goal. God's wrath is an affective expression of God's retributive justice, so that the issue is not ultimately wrath, but the nature of God's justice. Kinghorn's endorsement of consequentialism is clearly in view when he affirms, and I quote, expressions of divine wrath must be for the ultimate benevolent purpose God has of drawing people into relationship with himself, thereby bringing fullness of life to them, end quote. Not only is pure consequentialism at odds with the biblical view of divine justice, but consequentialism seems in any case ill-suited to serve as the justification for divine punishment, because God's judgment is described in the Bible as ultimately eschatological. The ungodly are storing up wrath for themselves for God's final day of judgment, Romans 2:5. Punishment imposed at that point could seemingly serve no other purpose than retribution, for all hope of reform is gone. But the damned are punished nonetheless, because they deserve it. God, in effect, carries out what Kant deemed to be necessary for a just society about to dissolve, namely to execute any prisoners condemned to death. Wessling defends God's ongoing punishment of the damned, aimed at persuading them to start down the path of spiritual transformation, but only at the admitted expense that, quote, one is willing to allow for post-mortem opportunities for salvation in hell, end quote. A consoling but unbiblical view. Matthew 25:46, 2 Thessalonians 1:9. Moreover, Wessling's view must either deny God's omniscience so that he continues to pursue a pointless action that only perpetuates suffering, or in effect transforms hell into purgatory and results in apokatastasis, the restoration of all things, a universalistic doctrine that is both unbiblical and condemned by the church. No universalist, Kinghorn struggles to justify God's punishment of the damned on consequentialist grounds as an act of his benevolence aimed at their reformation. He recognizes that, quote, we can use our God-given freedom to place ourselves eternally under God's wrath by decisively rejecting his offer to participate in the fellowship of self-giving love, end quote. Indeed, at some point, the opportunity for repentance will be gone. He says the time for possible repentance will have passed, end quote. So why does God continue to punish people beyond that point? Kinghorn's answer seems to be, he does not. Quote, for those in hell, God does not persist in pressing on them the truth about themselves, end quote, which Kinghorn interprets as the essence of divine wrath. With no consequentialist justification for punishment, God ceases to punish the damned in hell, though they may mistakenly think themselves to be under God's wrath. Rather, he simply leaves them alone. Hell, then, is not a punishment for sin. Rather, quote, hell is just a natural consequence of life apart from God, end quote. Citing Peter Geach to the effect that, quote, God does allow men to sin, and misery is the natural, not the arbitrarily inflicted consequence of sin to the sinner, end quote, Kinghorn claims that, quote, the alternative to Geach's position is to suggest that there is something of value, something good, about God devising an extra form of punishment for people in hell over and above what they are naturally experiencing apart from him, end quote. This is a misunderstanding of the retributivist position. The alternative to Geach's position is that the harsh treatment is not arbitrarily inflicted by God, but justly inflicted, and therefore something of value, something good. The punishment need not be something over and above the damned's being eternally separated from God. Rather, that separation is their just desert. Wessling calls Geach's position the natural consequences view. It must not be confused with the consequentialist view of divine justice. On consequentialism, God does punish the damned in hell for their sin with a view toward some extrinsic benefit. But on the natural consequences view, hell is not a punishment for sin flowing from divine justice, but simply a natural consequence of sin. Curiously, Kinghorn offers no biblical justification for so remarkable a thesis as the claim that hell is not divine punishment for sin. To the contrary, Wessling rightly points out that the natural consequences view, and I quote, certainly does not sit well, end quote, with texts like 1 Corinthians 11, 27-31, 2 Peter 2, 1-16, and Revelation 16, which speak of divine wrath, judgment, condemnation, and punishment. In any case, on Kinghorn's natural consequences view, it remains mysterious why God does not simply annihilate the damned and put them out of their misery, rather than allowing them to suffer interminably and undeservedly what Kinghorn calls the worst possible situation for humans. In general, the natural consequences view of God's response to sin is biblically inadequate. Certainly, sin is regarded in the Scriptures as self-destructive in its consequences, but God's response to sin is not reducible to permitting sin's natural consequences. Rather, God imposes justly deserved punishments in response to sin. Already in the story of the fall in Genesis 3, the words, "You shall surely die," mot tamut, occur repeatedly in the legal collections of the Pentateuch, condemning criminals to death. Victor Hamilton notes that all of the Mot Tamut passages in the Old Testament deal with either a punishment for sin or an untimely death as a result of punishment. So that in the story of the fall, the expression clearly conveys the announcement of a death sentence by divine or royal decree. In the New Testament, the forensic language is pervasive, especially in Paul's treatment of condemnation and justification in Romans. Recall Jimmy Dunn's conclusion, quote, that God's righteousness towards the people he has created includes wrath and judgment, as well as faithfulness and salvation, is clearly implicit in the sequences Romans 1:16-18 and 3:3-6. Those who deny the dikaiosune is a forensic term pay insufficient attention to Romans 4:4 and 5, where the forensic background is clear in the illusion of the legal impropriety of a judge justifying the ungodly. Conclusion. In sum, it is unbiblical and misguided to try to reduce the entire moral character of God to his love. God's moral perfection is most adequately conceived as his righteousness, which is a complex attribute comprising both his agape love and his retributive justice, both of which are plausibly essential to God. Thank you.
And I would be remiss if I didn't give out shout-outs to my assistant chapter director, Aaron Baca, for setting up this nifty system for us to use. This is really cool. So first question. This comes from our good friend, podcaster, the Faithiest Atheist. He has a fan, obviously, in this. and an okay. So, does God only become wrathful when evil usurps good and God has to intervene?
I would say that God is wrathful whenever evil is committed, whenever right moral order is violated, whether it usurps the good or simply asserts itself. God must punish evil. And his wrath is an affective expression of that justice.
Next question. Can you say more about what you mean by love? Now, let me preface that question with this. Punishing someone is not incompatible with loving that person. Love manifests itself differently from situation to situation. So therefore, can you say more about what you mean by love?
I think Eleanor Stump, in her book, Atonement, has given a very good description of love as desiring the flourishing and union with the beloved. So it is a desire for union with the beloved and then also a desire for the good of the beloved. And that seems to me to be a good understanding of God's love for us.
This question comes from Matt Jordan. Could God's retributive justice be explained in terms of respect for moral agents upon moral agents? And if so, would this be a plausible avenue for reducing divine justice to divine love?
What was the first part again, Bill?
Could God's retributive justice be explained in terms of respect for moral agents upon moral agents?
Well, I don't know. Respect for moral agents. It's not just, I think the problem with that is that it sounds victim-oriented, that out of respect for some person whose rights have been violated, God will act justly. But I take it that retributive justice says that the guilty deserve punishment, And so wholly apart from respect for the rights of the victims of injustice, simply the fact that someone is guilty of wrongdoing and evil in itself deserves punishment. And punishment is an intrinsic good because it is the just desert of the guilty.
Sarah Stone has a question for us. I'm scared to read this. After judgment, in the new heavens and new earth, if we don't continue sinning, how will that change God's love and righteousness towards humans, or our perception of his love?
It seems to me that in the eschaton, when our sins are completely purified and wiped away, and we come to see God in all of his goodness and beauty and holiness, that we will have a fuller, richer, and deeper experience of God's love. Paul says, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And so I anticipate that when we see the beatific vision of God in all of his supreme beauty and goodness, that our love for him will go off the scale.
Yeah. And do you think with that, the total removal of any sin nature and things would allow us to love God more deeply?
Say that again?
Do you think along with that, the total removal of the sin nature and being glorified would cause us to love God?
I am inclined to say that, is that God has created us at a sort of epistemic distance during this life, which enables us to rebel against him and refuse him, despite his being the very paradigm of goodness and love. But when we see him face to face, so to speak, in all his beauty and goodness, we will be drawn to him like iron filings to a gigantic electromagnet. And the freedom to sin will be effectively removed, I think, in heaven. And that would be very much in contrast to the damned in hell, who continue to experience alienation from God, and in that sense continue to sin. I don't think that we should think of the damned in hell as wringing their hands in remorse, wishing that God would allow them out. I suspect, based on what John says in Revelation, that the damned in hell will grow very placid in their hatred and rejection of God for punishing them as he does.
This question comes from Travis. On your rejection of the natural consequence view of hell, can a consequence simultaneously be a just punishment and a natural consequence? A father could intentionally allow consequences to punish, and then it ends there.
So what was the last phrase?
It kind of ended abruptly. A father could intentionally to allow consequences to punish.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. The point I was making is that if a natural consequence of sin is alienation and estrangement from God, it seems to me that that is not at all incompatible with God's consigning the damned to such an estate as their just desert. This is what they deserve. So I think it could be both a punishment and a natural consequence.
George Wilkinson asks, within divine command theory, can you explain how abhorrent commands in the Old Testament don't affect, distort, violate what it means to be perfectly good? Can you speak about God's relationship with good/bad commands?
If I understand the question, perhaps he's asking about horrific commands in the Old Testament, like the command to the Israelite soldiers to drive the Canaanites out of the land and to slaughter them. And I've defended the justice of such a command and its compatibility with God's perfect goodness and omnipotence at the website reasonablefaith.org. I think it's question of the week number 16. And I've never seen anyone offer a refutation of that proposal. They have fulminated against it emotionally and denounced it and mischaracterized it. But I've never seen a refutation of it. So I would refer folks to that question of the week, and I take it up again in a later question of the week, I think around 325, because I came to realize that the command that God gives the Israelite armies is not a command to go in and kill all the people. Rather, it is to drive them out of the land. For these Middle Eastern peoples, the land is everything. Even today in Israel, people talk about going to the land or visiting the land. And so what God was doing was he was depriving these Canaanite clans of the land. And that was their just desert. These cultures were horribly wicked, involved in all kinds of abominable practices. And God divested them of the land. And had they simply retreated in the face of the advancing Israelite army and left, no one needed to die. It wasn't a command to commit genocide. Only those who stayed behind to fight to try to retain the land that God had divested them of were to be killed. So when you look at it in that perspective, it's very different than a command to commit genocide. What God was doing was destroying them as nation states, but not giving a command to just kill everybody. Oh, and let me just add, in connection with the question, from a divine command point of view, that's entirely within God's prerogative to do, because God himself has no moral duties. God doesn't issue commands to himself. Moral duties and obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued from a qualified authority. And God doesn't issue imperatives to himself, so I don't think he has any moral duties. He simply has to operate in accord with his perfectly just and good nature. As William Alston has famously said in his article, What Euthyphro Should Have Said, the Kantian distinction between acting from duty and acting in accordance with duty can be applied to God on divine command theory. God doesn't act from duty, but he acts in accordance with his own perfectly good and righteous nature. And so the point of my questions of the week that I referred to was to show that there isn't any inconsistency between God's issuing such a command and God's being perfectly loving and just.
Wish we could just have a conversation up here. There's so many questions coming in. There's no way I can debate. So here's one. Do you think there is a tension between God's love and Rex?
I think there's a tremendous tension between God's love and justice. This was one of the most interesting features that came out of my study of the doctrine of the atonement, which you notice Lewis referred to in Robert Garcia's talk. If love and justice are both essential to God and therefore cannot be compromised, the question is, how can God be perfectly just in punishing every sin, giving every sin its just desert, and yet be loving and forgiving at the same time? God faces what legal theorists have called the dilemma of the merciful judge. A judge who wants to be merciful and does not do what the law requires shows himself to be unjust. But if he acts justly, then he's not acting mercifully. He's just doing what the law requires. And so I think there is this tremendous dilemma that God faces. And the doctrine of substitutionary atonement beautifully solves this, because Christ, by becoming human and vicariously enduring the suffering that we deserved as the punishment for our sins, thereby frees us from our liability to punishment and affords to us a legal pardon from God, which we can then either accept or refuse. So the full demands of God's justice and love are met through substitutionary atonement, whose legal coherence I defended some extent in this book called The Atonement and the Death of Christ.
It's just an interesting question. Maybe it's just interesting to me, but it's perspective on something we all know. Yeah. The prodigal son sins against the father. Does the father do wrong to forgive him and restore him without any sort of punishment?
I think it's really important in understanding that the parables are meant to teach one central point. And therefore, it's illegitimate to try to extrapolate theological doctrines from certain parables of Jesus. And the point of the story of the prodigal son is to condemn the Pharisees for their self-righteous indignation at God's pardon of sinners. But it's not meant to give an account of the doctrine of the atonement, which, of course, the gospel writers affirm in the centrality of the cross to all four of the gospels. And in the Last Supper in particular, where Jesus symbolically portrays the giving of his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins. So I understand that the Father welcomes the Son back without any sort of sacrifice on the Son's part to atone for sin, but that's simply not the point of the parable. The parable is to condemn the older brother and the Pharisees, for they're not rejoicing when one sinner comes to find salvation.
Well, we'll say this will be our last question. Is the desire to collapse God's attributes down to his love motivated, at least in part, by a strong view of divine simplicity? What do you think?
We mustn't confuse the identity thesis with divine simplicity. According to divine simplicity, God doesn't have a plurality of attributes. In fact, he doesn't really have any attributes at all. His essence is simply the pure act of being, the act of existence. So it's not a reductive thesis the way the identity thesis is. The identity thesis says that God's moral character is reducible to his love, and that attribute of love is fundamental to everything else. That's not divine simplicity. Divine simplicity doesn't affirm any sort of hierarchy of rankings among the attributes of God. It's simply to say God doesn't have a plurality of attributes. So you can affirm divine simplicity without adopting this reductionistic identity thesis.